Parashah 50, Ki Tavo, when you come. Now this week's Parashah moves on from the general stipulations that form the treaty document toward the outcome and the result of what and how Israel will have to apply those rulings and regulations that Moshe has previously put before the people. Today, Moshe expands on the instructions that he's given in Devarim chapter 11, verses 29, about the two mountains, Gerizim and Eval, where he said, when Yahweh your God brings you into the land, you are to put a blessing on Mount Gerizim and a curse on Mount Eval. Now beginning in chapter 27, Moshe calls all the leaders of Israel together and tells them what the people are to do on those two mountains. Firstly, they're going to build an altar of uncut stones and cover it completely with plaster. Then, having plastered the whole altar, they are then going to inscribe all the words of the blessings and the curses which will be spoken by the Kohanim. That was a broad outline that Moshe gave to the people while they were still on the plains of Moab. Now I want to turn my attention for a few moments to the words of Yehoshua. In chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, we're told that they were actually the two mountains Moshe spoke about. But before we get to those mountains, we remember that Yehoshua had to fight two battles. Firstly, when they crossed the Jordan, they marched towards Jericho and walked around it 7 times, and on the 7th time, of course, the walls collapsed and they conquered the people of the city. Now, following the overthrow of Jericho, they were now battle ready, and they went to Ai. And after one failed attempt, they finally conquered the city the second time around. Then they marched northward towards the city of Shechem, and that's in the valley, of course, between Gerizim and Eval. As instructed by Moshe, Yehoshua built the altar on Mount Eval and covered it with plaster. And then the Kohanim, in the office that was an office at that time, made a burnt offering and a sacrifice of a peace offering, as instructed. Next, Yehoshua in 8:33 says, all Israel, including their leaders, officials, and judges, stood on either side of the ark in front of the Kohanim. The foreigners were all there along with their citizens. Half the people were in front of Mount Gerizim and the other half in front of Mount Eval, just as Moshe had ordered. While all the people were still gathered there, in verse 34 and 35, Yehoshua read all of the Torah, the blessings and the curses, according to everything that was written. There was not a word that Moshe had ordered that was not read before the whole assembly of Israel, including the women and the little ones and the foreigners that were among them. So we see that what Moshe had actually commanded in today's Parashah was carried out to the letter by his faithful servant, Yehoshua. So returning once again to today's Parashah, we find it continues with a list of blessings bestowed upon Israel, providing they kept the mitzvot of Yahweh. Starting in 28 verses 1 and 2, Moshe warns, if you listen closely to what Yahweh your God says, observing and obeying all his mitzvot, which I am giving you today, then Yahweh your God will raise you high above all the nations of the earth. However, as we see, for every blessing given, there was also a corresponding curse or a negative response. The first blessings are listed in the earlier parts of chapter 28, and the curses follow separately later on in that chapter. So for the sake of clarity, I've brought them together, the blessings and the curses, beginning in verse 3, the corresponding curse from verse 16. And then subsequently, we go through the pairs like that in the same sequential pairing. So in verse 3, a blessing on you in the city and a blessing on you in the countryside. Verse 16, or a curse on you in the city and a curse on you in the countryside. Next, a blessing on the fruit of your body, the fruit of your land and the fruit of your livestock, the young of your cattle and flocks, or a curse upon the fruit of your body and the fruit of your land, and of course on your livestock and cattle. Verse 5, a blessing on your grain basket and kneading bowl. Conversely, a curse on your grain basket and kneading bowl. Verse 6, a blessing on you when you go out and a blessing on you when you come in. The reverse, or a curse on you when you come in, or a curse when you go out. Then in verse 7, when Yahweh causes your enemies to attack you, you will defeat them, and they will advance in one way and flee in 7 other ways. Verse 25, Yahweh your God will cause you to be defeated before your enemies, or you will advance on them one way and flee before them in 7 different directions. You will become an object of horror to every kingdom on earth. In verse 13, he carries on, you will lend to many nations and not borrow. Yahweh will make you the head and not the tail, and you will be only above and never below. By contrast, in verse 43, the foreigner living with you will rise higher and higher, while you sink lower and lower. He will lend to you, and you will not lend to him. He will be the head, and you will be the tail. Moshe continues in verse 8, saying, Yahweh will order the blessings to be on your barns and everything that you undertake. He will bless you in the land that Yahweh your God is giving you. Conversely, in verse 21, Yahweh will bring a plague that will stay with you until he has exterminated you from the land. Yet again, in verse 12, Yahweh will open for you his good treasure, the sky, from the sky, and give your land its rain at the right season, and bless you with everything you undertake. Conversely, in verse 23, the sky over your head will be like brass, and the earth under you like iron. Yahweh will turn the rain on your land that your land needs into powder and dust that will fall from the sky until you are destroyed. And finally, in chapter 28, verses 9 through 13, Yahweh will establish you as a people separated out for himself, as he has sworn to you, if you will observe the mitzvot of Yahweh your God and follow his ways. Then all the peoples of the earth will see that the name of Yahweh is with you in your presence, and they will be afraid of you. If you will listen to and obey the mitzvot of Yahweh your God, it will all go well with you. Otherwise, the consequence, as stated in verse 15, if you refuse to pay attention to what Yahweh your God is saying, and do not observe and obey all his mitzvot and regulations I am giving you today, then all the following curses will be put upon you in abundance. Having completed the best blessings and the curses, as they related to Israel's relationship with the land, all those related to the land, Moshe then lays before them another 12 personal curses. In verses 15 through 26 in chapter 27. Those 12 curses appear to be the ones that were actually written on the side of the altar on Mount Ebal. In the time when Yehoshua stood there, they were there alone with no blessings. At the end of each of the curses, Moshe says, all the people are to respond by saying, Amen. So as we read them earlier, I don't want to repeat them all now, but bear in mind that at the end of each one, each person is saying Amen, acknowledging that what had actually been written on the sides of the altar would be directly related to them personally. So when they later turn their backs on Yahweh, they will be constantly reminded that they said amen to each one of those curses. The blessing and the curse combination that we considered earlier, all related to Israel's connection and relationship with Eretz Israel, while those 12 latter ones, which they all said amen to, are all personal matters. Now the same things and the same principles apply in Eretz Israel even today. Chapter 28 continues. It continues on in the same vein right through to the end, with warnings of bad things that were destined to occur, both in the lead up to the destruction of the first temple and latterly what could be expected in the last 3 years leading up to the destruction of the second temple. The words that Moshe uses describe the siege of Jerusalem in the years 67 to 70 CE. But these are particularly reflected in Moshe's words in chapter 28, verses 53 to 57, where the actions of both men and women are totally depraved and inhumane. Yeshua, 37 years before the siege of Jerusalem, reflected what Moshe had said, as we read in Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 through 22, and again in Luke 21, 20 to 24. However, the gospel accounts are relatively tame in their description, whereas Moshe certainly laid it on the line in very graphic detail. Moshe also takes the narrative well on past the destruction of the second temple. Particularly in chapter 28, verse 37, he says, "You will be so devastated as to become a proverb and a laughingstock among all the peoples to which Yahweh your God will drive you." Those words were repeated numerous times during the 1900 years between 70 and 167 CE. It's on 1967 CE. So we see the whole of chapter 28 is possibly the most graphic and grisly description Moshe has ever put forward. But it was necessary because human nature, being what it is, and even Israel, who had been promised so many blessings that only Yahweh could bestow upon a person, still they found it easier to follow the ways of other nations and ignore their God and King. Rather than finish this parashah on a deeply depressing note, Yahweh changes the tone by reflecting back and reminding them what Yahweh had done for the former generation. He takes the people of that second generation back on yet another journey through all that their forefathers had experienced, from the time of being in slavery in Egypt right through until they actually ended up on the plains of Moab. Those were his last words in his last days. So he needed to lay it out strongly for the people of that second generation, because he knew that they were going to enter the land, that he was going to die east of the Yarden. Hence the whole of chapter 29 shows that even in times of great adversity, Yahweh always had his people's welfare at heart. As we have seen in this parashah, it's been a difficult task for Moshe to impart to the people of Israel just how important it was that they remain constantly close to Yahweh and to listen and live by all his mitzvot. But one question remains that needs to be asked. Why did Yahweh want the curses written in plaster on the altar on Mount Ebal? After all, the Mishkan was going to be erected in Shiloh, miles from Ebal. Is it possible that the blessings and the curses were delivered in Shechem, there between the two mountains? The blessings and the curses were to be written on that altar on Mount Ebal, because that was the same place where Yahweh first spoke to Abraham about the future of his descendants. Maybe it was fitting that the renewed covenant or treaty between the king and his subjects should take place in that same location. Now that question has never yet been answered. But to conclude our consideration of today's parashah on a good note, I want to turn right back to the beginning, to chapter 26, verses 1 and 2, where we read, "When you have come into the land that Yahweh your God is giving you as an inheritance, to take possession and settle there, you are to take the first fruits of all your crops the ground will yield, which you have harvested from the land, and Yahweh your God is giving you. Then you'll put them in a basket and take them to the place where Yahweh your God will choose his name to live," which of course, that place was Shiloh. And the ritual that had to be followed was truly a blessing of the highest order, because each man had to take his basket and place the first fruits in the hands of the Cohen, who would put it down in front of the altar in the presence of Yahweh. Each man had to remember who he was and where he came from. As he had to say, "My ancestor was a nomad from Aram. He went down to Egypt, few in number, and stayed. There he became a great and strong and populous nation. But the Egyptians treated us badly. They oppressed us and imposed harsh slavery on us. We cried out to Yahweh, the God of our ancestors. Yahweh heard us and saw our misery, toil, and oppression. And Yahweh brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, with great terror and with signs and wonders. He now has brought us to this place and given us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey." So how could any man in Israel turn his back on Yahweh, having uttered those words on 3 separate occasions each year? Who in his right mind would want to turn away from such an awesome God? Even modern Israel now, established back in the land, still does not observe the Torah in the way that Yahweh wanted. The reason is because they are still reflecting the democratic nations who have abused them over such a long period of exile. Also, and most importantly, they're not fully understanding the sovereign plan of God because they don't know their Messiah. They are still awaiting and still misunderstand the Mashiach. They are still waiting for Yeshua, but they don't know him as Yeshua. Only when he returns will Israel be able to fully understand where they went so horribly wrong. Because as Shaul said in 2 Corinthians 3:14-17, their minds were made stone-like. For to this day the same veil remains over them when they read Moshe. It has not been unveiled, because only the Messiah can remove the veil. Yes, today, even when Moshe is read, the veil lies over their heart. But, says the Torah, when someone turns to Yahweh, the veil is taken away. Now, Yahweh is in this text meant as the Spirit, and when the Spirit of Yahweh is there is freedom, and they come to know him for whom he really is. So only then will Israel be restored to what Moshe said in chapter 28, verse 13. Yahweh will make you the head and not the tail, and you will be only above, never below. Shabbat Shalom.